Hello, this is Hollisa Alewine welcoming you to the HRN Torah portion of the week. This week, the Torah portion is Vayeshev, which means, and he settled. It's Genesis 37:1 through 40:23. In Hebrew, we would say Bereshit. If you'd like to turn there in your Bibles, we're going to take a look at what it means to be quick and what it means to be patient, not necessarily slow. Sometimes in our world, we tend to label those who are slow, but actually they're just patient. And we're demonstrating impatience in bringing things to fruition in our lives. So the lesson focus today is going to be discerning when it's good to be quick and when it's good to be slow in our maturing process. We might call it the quick and the bread, because with bread, you can buy quick rise yeast, and the dough will rise much faster for you, and you can get that bread in the oven much faster, and you can eat it much faster. But in the body of Messiah, Yeshua talked about how long it takes for that dough to be leavened. And so as human beings, sometimes we need to learn when to be quick, when to respond immediately to the Holy Spirit, and when to slow down and to be patient sometimes. Because the revelation of a dream or a vision in our lives sometimes is preceded by many weeks, many months, many years, perhaps many decades before we see the ultimate fulfillment of that dream or that vision. And it would be easy to lose hope, just like it would have been easy for Joseph to lose hope once he's received his vision. But this Torah portion, I believe, gives us some clues as to how we as believers can look at his process, and it will encourage us in our process, in that time lapse between the revelation of the dream and the realization of the dream. Because what lives between what we expected and what we feel like we're receiving is disappointment. And what can grow in there is bitterness. Instead of anticipation, instead of faith, instead of hope, if we believed we received this much and we were expecting, something much greater, then disappointment and bitterness, a lot of grief can grow in that space in between. So in this week's Torah portion, we'll look at some significant events. Each Torah portion does have significant events. We see that Jacob, who is now Israel, he returns to Canaan, and he settles there in Canaan. We know that Joseph is a favored son at this point. He's the favored son of Rachel, and Jacob gives him a special tunic, a special coat, and Joseph relates this dream that he has about the way that it's translated for him is that he's going to lord over or to prevail over his brothers and his mother and his father. You can see how this might cause some jealousy. We know that Joseph is caught by his brothers. He's imprisoned, and then he's sold into Egypt, where, again, he's going to be imprisoned. We have this strange little interruption, but it's not really. Sometime we'll have to break this little interruption down as it concerns Tamar and Judah, because it really does work into the story and Judah's ultimate transformation from one who wants to take advantage of Joseph and sell Joseph into one who is able to exchange his life for Benjamin's. And losing his own son seems to be part of that transformation of his heart. We know that Judah is going to father Peretz and Zerach, and back in Egypt, Joseph is going to go to work for Potiphar as his slave until Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. We'll see Joseph thrown into prison again, but then we'll see him rise to administration within the prison. And then finally, Joseph is going to interpret dreams for both the baker and the cupbearer. And I think that's the secret to understanding this process with Joseph, those final dreams that he interprets for the baker and the cupbearer. There's a time lapse when the baker has baked the goods, the delicacies for Pharaoh. He holds on to them for too long. In fact, he holds on to them for so long that the birds of the air have an opportunity to come and try to steal the baked goods. But the cupbearer, very quickly, he squeezes the grapes and immediately hands the juice to Pharaoh. So he was very quick to minister to the king, whereas the baker is a little slow in ministering to the king. So the question remains, what kind of framework do we have that could help us know when to be fast, when to be quick, and then when to be slow, when to be patient? Now, the younger Joseph, he's described exactly as his mother, just in a male context. His mother's described as Yafa, as beautiful, and Joseph too, he's Yafeh. He's a handsome young man. And in his blessings that we read about later, we know that he was given the blessings, it says, of the breast and of the womb. And if we think about other contexts where we hear blessings like that, they're not necessarily construed as blessings, but as places where people are stuck. When Paul is writing, he's saying, you know, at this point, you should be eating solid food. You should be eating meat. But I find you still drinking milk like a baby, as though you haven't been weaned. So here again, there's the question of, have I been growing and maturing fast enough in the Word? Or am I still a baby? Am I still relying on my mother for my processing of my food, to turn it into milk, to make it simple? And there is a time for things to be made simple. As we're first studying the Word, we need people to help us process the simplicity of the Word. But as we grow older, we should become a little more independent in our study habits. Weaning, however, was usually performed at about 3 years of age, as we look at the patterns of Scripture. And so as we look at Joseph as having the blessings of the breast and the womb, we can see that his descendants, are they blessed with the milk of the Word? Absolutely. Are they patient with the milk of the Word? That seems to be in question, because if we remain in that milk, we remain pretty much at the mercy of El Shaddai. We have to rely a lot on His grace instead of our maturity as we walk more independently in His Word. And El Shaddai, it comes from that Hebrew word shad, which literally means the breast. So He's a nurturing Father. And so in that respect, there's that role there of the mother, the comforter. And Joseph's blessing was to feed on that milk of the Word and having blessings of childlike nurture. But for every child, the ultimate goal is not to remain on that milk of the Word, but to eventually mature and develop, the proper appetites for the heavier food, for the meat, for the things that will really make you grow strong and independent to the point that you can help nurture other people, not to always rely on someone else to help you filter the information. And so for Joseph, I think what we're seeing in the beginning of the Torah portion is the beginning of weaning. Even though we know that the age of 3 was the literal weaning age, in Joseph's account, we know that he's still very strongly attached to his father, and his father's very strongly attached to him. Sometimes the problem with weaning is not that the child is so attached to the mother, but the mother is still attached to the child and is not ready for that initial separation and discomfort that's required for weaning. But we have a little clue here. If we turn to Psalm 13 and we look at verse 2, we have a clue. It says, "Surely I have composed and quieted my soul." Remember that word soul. "Like a weaned child rests against his mother. My soul is like a weaned child within me." Now the psalm there is using a specific word for soul, and it's nephesh. Nephesh is that bundle of appetites, emotions, desires, and intellect. So when we're ready to be weaned, when we're ready to wean our appetites, when we're ready to wean our desires, when we're ready to wean our intellect, and to become more independent, we actually enter a state of quietness, of contentment. In other words, there's a discipline of the soul, of the nephesh that takes place when we are weaned, just like there's a discipline of the appetites of a child when he or she is weaned. And so the psalmist is saying it's the soul part of us that needs to be weaned. And when we look at those key words like soul, we can go back again to the actual physical transformation. And again, Hebrew children were weaned at about the age of 3. This would be a point where their souls could be, they had been nourished, they were healthy, they were strong, but they had reached a point where they could accept a diet of solid food, and it was a cause for great celebration. And I think it should be a cause for great celebration in the body of Messiah when someone is weaned off the milk of the Word and transforms and is able to handle some of the meat. Even if we have to cut it into small pieces for them, they can still digest that meat of the Word. And there were great celebrations that would surround that official date of weaning, again, at about the age of 3. And that's what we see in Joseph as a young man. His father has really clung to him. He's really become, the description with Benjamin was that their souls were knit together. Their desires, their appetites, their intellects, completely knit together. It's very likely that first he felt this way about Joseph until he lost him, because he was the child of Rachel, his beloved. And he saw more of himself probably in Joseph than perhaps he did in the other brothers. And so did he overdo things with Joseph? It kind of looks like he did show some favoritism. And that didn't really help Joseph's relationship with his other brothers. So he's going to require a weaning period before the dreams, the visions can be realized, where he could actually lead his brothers in a time of trouble. Because at this point in his maturity, he's not able to. He's a tattletale. He runs and he tells tales to his father about his brother's behavior. That's someone who's not weaned yet. That's someone who still relies on others for their self-esteem. Because if I carry a tale about my brothers, or I carry a tale about my coworkers to my boss, and then I get that little pat on the back, good job, good eye, thanks for letting me know, and now I'm working on this relationship with my supervisor or with my father, but what am I doing? I'm doing it at the expense of my brothers, at the expense of my coworkers. So it becomes very self-serving, not other-serving. So with Joseph, he might be older, he might be 17, but he still needs to be weaned from Dad. And we get a little clue that the age of 3 represents a time of weaning, because when Samuel's mother, remember he's 3 years old, when Samuel's mother takes him and dedicates him to the tabernacle service, she also takes a 3-year-old bull as kind of that representation of the sacrifice to the tabernacle. And so sometimes as we look at blessings, timing is everything. We can do the right thing, but we can do it at the wrong time. We can do the right thing, but we can do it in immaturity. And what we know is at the time that Joseph is tattling on his brothers, that number one, the brothers are not prepared to accept any authority from him, and he's not really doing anything that would merit their respect or his authority over them. So as we see the blessings later on, where Jacob reiterates the message of the tunic that he gave to Joseph, but he blesses him as not necessarily with the scepter of authority, but with a consecration of authority. He calls him a Nazir above his brothers. And he gives him the trademark of fruitfulness, which again would imply that Joseph has grown, that he has matured to the point that he can produce fruit because of his consecration. And sometimes to be consecrated, we have to be set apart from people for a time. You know, we've all experienced a thing where, you know, maybe we're walking in a deeper walk with Yeshua, but maybe friends or family don't understand this deeper walk. In order to consecrate us, in order to mature us in our faith, and number one, you know, kind of remind us that we don't know as much as we think we know, sometimes he has to set us apart in order to bring those dreams and visions to fulfillment in our lives. But later, as the blessing goes on Jacob as a Nazir, like a Nazarene, you can hear Nazarene in that word. We know that he also gives Joseph an extra portion. And we say, well, this is the extra portion of the firstborn. Possibly, but damages for injustice are very much a part and a foundation of the Torah. And Jacob may have considered Joseph's lost years when he was in slavery, and he knew that restitution was due from those brothers for that act of kidnapping and selling him into slavery. And it may have been that he took their portions and included in his portion as the proper restitution so that the brothers would not continue in that relationship feeling as though something were still owed him from that inheritance, that this would actually make it right. You can't get back the lost years, but you can compensate in place of that. And the Torah teaches this sort of process. The Nazir above his brothers, though, I think it turns us back to the Nazirite vow, because it is taken by a man or by a woman who wants to engage in a greater level of holiness. You don't have to be a Levite. You don't have to be a priest. You don't have to be a king. Any Israelite can take a Nazirite vow. And what does it do? It consecrates us to a greater level of holiness. And this seems to be what Joseph is receiving from Jacob, his father, a consecration to a greater level of holiness. And we can actually see that reflected when he runs from Potiphar's wife and refuses to compromise his holiness, even though he knows it could cost him his life or a life in prison. So what's the story here? We need to be patient. If the Father has revealed something to us, we need to be cautious to whom we reveal that dream or that vision, especially if it affects that person, because the brothers and even Jacob seem to misinterpret Joseph's dream. And it could have been the way that he transmitted the dream or the message. In his own immaturity, he may have boasted a little bit. He may have conveyed the message very proudly. Well, look at me. You're all going to bow down to me. He had the vision, but he didn't have the maturity to execute it. And sometimes when we share our dreams, our visions, our goals too soon with people, we don't have the maturity to transmit the message without a little bit of that leaven, without a little bit of that quick bread. And at that point, we have the vision, but we don't have the ability to execute it properly, which is to execute it humbly and sacrificially. So we can tell from the reactions of Joseph's father and brother that he really didn't have the maturity to transmit this message to them. Even though we know that it was going to be fulfilled, that was part of revealing the vision. Having the maturity to execute and the patience and the years that it takes to attain that maturity, that's a tough waiting time. That's the time when that soul has to become like a weaned child. It has to learn to be comforted no matter the circumstance and no matter how far away it seems the fulfillment of that dream may be. I know when we're younger, it seems like if we don't do it now, we'll be too old to do it later. But that's not true. Moses didn't go back and lead Israel out of Egypt until he was 80 years old. At 40, all he knew how to do was do things in the flesh. You disagree with me, you do something I don't like, you violate the Torah, I'll kill you. And we have a lot of people with that attitude. You violate the Torah, I'll kill you. But the Moses who returns comes and he's very patient, and step by step, he says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is greater than the gods of Egypt. Let's start here, and if you don't believe this plague, we'll have another. And if you don't believe this plague, and it took 10 steps for that process of death to actually affect the firstborn. So like Paul pointed out to his congregations, it's pointless to boast in the flesh about spiritual gifts. You can kind of ruin the gift for others in that respect. So there's two problems that, Joseph, he's a promising young man. He's a handsome young man. Lots of gifts, intelligence, administration, but his timing and his skill in relating to others. It doesn't matter how much talent you have or how much Torah scholarship you have, if you're not humble and mature in relating that message to others, then you're really just banging your head against a wall. And then you'll be wondering why people don't like you or receive you. Well, you have to look back at yourself. Have you allowed that message to mature with you? So just like many youngsters we probably know who have really keen minds, sometimes they're a little slow to render respect to others in the family who they perceive as not being as intelligent, not as quick, not as talented, and so forth. So being too quick like that is the sign of an unweaned child. Because an unweaned child, an unweaned soul, nefesh, it really doesn't want to postpone the gratification. It doesn't want to postpone the fulfillment. It needs it right now. I don't want to wait years for this. I want it right now. And that was Esau's problem. I'm hungry right now. Take the birthright. I want to get married right now. I'll take these women that my parents don't approve of. He didn't have the patience for the long-term plan. Eat quickly, marry quickly, do everything quickly, prejudge, read a little bit of information and form a doctrine. Instead of having the patience to work through those questions and to work through those desires and those appetites and those intellectual pursuits. This is an example of how if you're too quick, you can end up dead. But on the other hand, when we're rendering to the Father, and there's a commandment that we know that it should not be delayed. There's some commandments we know we should do right now. Right now. Did Joseph know to run away from Potiphar's wife right now? He knew, and he was quick. And probably in the eyes of the world, he was dead after that. But in the eyes of the Father, he was learning how to live. Our worlds are switched. So there's some seasoning. Even Jacob, it says, he kind of ponders the dreams in his heart. Even though he rebukes Joseph a little bit for his immaturity in relating the message, he still puts it in his heart and allows those dreams to season. And that's what we have to do with our dreams. When the Father reveals things to us, or he gives us a path, We have to let those things season in our hearts sometimes without necessarily sharing them with people who are going to feel that we're slighting them or we're trying to lord over them. Don't tell that dream just too quickly. Sometimes we have to be like Jacob, who just says it kept the matter in his mind. And we have a clue that Jacob wasn't handling the vision well. He wasn't handling the favor of his father well. Because in Genesis 37:15, we have a contronym, which is a word that can mean two opposite things. It says that Joseph was blundering in the fields. It might say walking in the field, but as we read it in Hebrew, it's like he's blundering around, like he doesn't know what he's doing when he's looking for his brothers. And that's exactly what's happening. He's looking for a relationship with his brothers, but he's blundering because he's immature and he's still proud. He's still that quick-rise dough. And he hasn't learned the maturity of waiting and seasoning and keeping matters in his heart. And so in a sense, he was torn in the field. Why? Because he brought out the worst in his brothers. He brought out the beast in them. And they were the ones who tore his clothes and bloodied them and returned them to his father. And sometimes that's what happens when we reveal something too soon. When we don't learn how to relate to others with humility, they will turn and tear us. And they'll just tell the father, I don't know what happened. We found these torn clothes. But it's only in his maturity that he learned how to bring the brothers together, how to actually be that family leader that he was prophesied to be. And he really learned the true message. The true message was not that I, Joseph, will be Lord over all my brothers. It's that I, Joseph, I will be that vehicle of salvation, of servanthood for my brothers. I will make sure the family is intact. And because what does he do? He lines the brothers up at the table in the order of their birth. What does he do? He gives them the respect that is due to each one that apparently he's not been giving them prior to this period of being consecrated and set apart to learn maturity. He says, you're all important. You're all here at the table. My job really wasn't to lord over you. My job was to save you and to bring you together as brothers. And he even reminds them, don't fight on the way home. That's not my will. That's not what I'm about. I'm not going to get you back. It's about learning how to be a family. That was the vision all along. I hope you've enjoyed this investigation into Vayeshev, and I hope you'll join us next time for the Torah portion.